During the spring of 2005, in a peaceful suburb in Indiana, a young girl suddenly vanished, but no one could explain what happened. But exactly 10 years later, one small detail reopened the case, and it exposed a dark secret. The town of Oakmont, Indiana, was a thriving, deeply connected community where the streets were lined with old oak trees and neighbors always knew each other by name. It was a place where people felt entirely safe leaving their bicycles on the front lawn and their doors unlocked during the day. At the very center of this prosperous, quiet town was Mayor Caleb Warren. Caleb was a highly charismatic, deeply driven man in his early 40s. He had built his entire career on a foundation of order, progress, and absolute control. He was serving his second term as mayor, and he ran the city with a firm, confident hand. He was married to a kind, patient woman named Sarah, and together, they were the most prominent, respected couple in the county. But for Caleb, his political career and his public image were entirely secondary to the absolute center of his universe, his 15-year-old daughter, Macy. Macy Warren was a beautiful, incredibly grounded young girl. Unlike many teenagers who rebelled against the heavy pressure of growing up in a prominent political family, Macy handled the spotlight with a quiet, effortless grace. She was kind, she was a dedicated student, and she spent her weekends volunteering at the local animal shelter. She had a very distinct, small birthmark located just beside her left eyebrow. She also wore a delicate, silver necklace shaped like a small sun, a piece of jewelry Caleb had custom-made and given to her on her 14th birthday. Macy loved the necklace so much that she absolutely never took it off. Caleb and Macy shared a deeply special bond. Despite his grueling schedule at City Hall, Caleb never missed a single one of her school events. He believed that he could completely protect his family from the unpredictable chaos of the outside world simply by working hard and maintaining order in his town. But on a warm, breezy Friday evening in late April of 2005, the absolute safety of Oakmont was completely, violently shattered, and the powerful mayor learned a terrifying lesson about how quickly control can evaporate into thin air. It was the night of the Oakmont High School annual spring community fundraiser. The massive event was held on the sprawling green athletic fields behind the high school. It was the absolute biggest social event of the year. Nearly 1,000 people were gathered under the bright, towering stadium lights. There were colorful carnival games, loud music playing from large speakers, and dozens of local food tents serving hot food. The air was filled with the smell of sweet cotton candy and the loud, echoing sounds of children laughing. Caleb and Sarah were standing near the main entrance, heavily surrounded by local business owners and city council members. Caleb was in his element, warmly shaking hands, kissing bobbies, and laughing with his constituents. Macy was standing a few yards away, surrounded by a close group of her high school friends. She was wearing a light blue denim jacket and her favorite silver sun necklace. Caleb glanced over at her several times throughout the evening, smiling as he watched her laugh and joke with her friends. It was a perfectly normal, deeply happy American evening. At exactly 8:30 in the evening, the air began to grow slightly chilly as the sun completely disappeared below the tree line. Caleb walked over to his wife and quietly suggested that they start wrapping up their conversations and head home. Sarah agreed, exhausted from the long week. Caleb turned to look for his daughter near the carnival games, where she had been standing just moments before. But Macy was not there. Caleb didn't panic. He simply assumed she had walked over to the food tents or was waiting near the bleachers. He spent the next 10 minutes casually walking through the dense crowd, nodding at people, scanning the faces of the teenagers for his daughter. When he couldn't find her, he walked up to her closest friend, a young girl named Chloe. Caleb smiled and asked where Macy had gone. Chloe pointed toward the dark, sprawling parking lot located just behind the stadium. She was cold, Chloe explained casually. She said she was going to run out to your car to grab a heavier sweater from the backseat. That was about 15 minutes ago. Caleb thanked the young girl and began walking toward the parking lot. The bright, chaotic noise of the carnival slowly faded behind him as he stepped away from the stadium lights and into the dimly lit rows of parked vehicles. He walked down the long row of cars until he reached his large, black town car. He expected to see Macy standing near the trunk, waiting for him to unlock the doors. But the car was completely empty. The dark asphalt surrounding the vehicle was entirely deserted. Caleb frowned, pulling his cellular phone from his jacket pocket. He dialed Macy's number. He held the phone to his ear, listening to the long, rhythmic rings. The call went directly to her automated voicemail. A tiny, cold seed of worry suddenly took root in the bottom of Caleb's stomach. Macy was incredibly responsible. She always answered her phone, especially when she knew her parents were ready to leave. Caleb quickly walked back into the bright lights of the stadium. He found his wife and asked if she had seen Macy. Sarah shook her head, instantly noticing the tight, tense look on her husband's face. Together, they began frantically searching the entire athletic field. They checked the bathrooms, they checked the gymnasium, and they desperately asked every single teacher and chaperone if they had seen the mayor's daughter. No one had seen her. By 9:15, the cold seed of worry had violently erupted into a massive, suffocating wave of absolute, primal panic. Caleb did not wait another second. He bypassed the standard emergency dispatch completely and dialed the personal cell phone of the Oakmont chief of police. Within 10 minutes, the entire high school was placed on a massive, highly aggressive lockdown. Marked police cruisers tore into the parking lot, their red and blue emergency lights violently slicing through the dark night. Uniformed officers blocked every single exit, absolutely refusing to let any vehicle leave the property. The cheerful, loud community fundraiser was instantly transformed into a chaotic, deeply terrifying crime scene. Detectives began aggressively separating and interviewing hundreds of people. They spoke to the teenagers, the food vendors, and the teachers. They desperately tried to establish a firm timeline of Macy's exact movements. The results of the mass interviews were entirely baffling. Macy had walked away from her friends at exactly 8:15. She was walking calmly, completely alone, toward the parking lot. Several people remembered seeing her walking past the ticket booth. She did not look distressed. She was not running. But after she passed the ticket booth, she simply vanished into thin air. There were no witnesses who saw anyone approach her. There was absolutely no ransom demand left on the mayor's vehicle. No one heard a single scream, and no one saw a struggle. In a crowded public space, filled with nearly 1,000 people, a high-profile 15-year-old girl had been completely erased from the world without leaving a single trace behind. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. By midnight, the heavy, agonizing reality of the situation had completely settled over the town. Caleb and Sarah Warren were sitting inside the principal's office, entirely surrounded by senior police commanders. Sarah was weeping uncontrollably, holding her face in her trembling hands. Caleb sat completely frozen in a chair, his eyes wide and hollow. The massive institutional power he wielded as a mayor was completely useless. He could order roads paved and budgets balanced, but he was utterly powerless to find his own child. The police chief launched a massive, highly coordinated search operation before the sun even began to rise. Hundreds of civilian volunteers, heavily armed state troopers, and highly trained search dogs completely flooded the town. They dragged the local ponds, scoured the dense woods bordering the high school, and aggressively knocked on every single door in the surrounding neighborhoods. They were desperately looking for dropped items, a torn piece of clothing, or any physical evidence of a violent struggle. At exactly 7 o'clock the next morning, a patrol officer searching a public park located nearly 2 miles away from the high school finally found the very first piece of physical evidence. The officer immediately radioed for detectives and completely taped off a small, quiet section of the park near a decorative duck pond. When Detective Miller, the lead investigator on the case, arrived at the park, he expected to see a chaotic, terrifying scene. He expected to find a dropped item lying in the mud, heavily suggesting a violent abduction. But what the detective actually found completely shattered the entire psychological profile of the case. Sitting perfectly upright on a green wooden park bench was a small, dark red canvas backpack. Caleb and Sarah were immediately brought to the scene. Sarah violently collapsed into her husband's arms the second she saw the bag. It was undeniably Macy's backpack. But the bag had not been hastily dropped in a blind panic. It was not torn, and there was absolutely no dirt on the fabric. The backpack was sitting exactly in the center of the wooden bench, perfectly arranged. The heavy zippers were completely closed. Resting gently and deliberately on top of the red canvas was Macy's cellular phone. Detective Miller put on a pair of latex gloves and carefully unzipped the heavy bag. He expected the contents to be chaotic or violently ransacked. Instead, everything inside was perfectly, meticulously organized. Her school notebooks were stacked neatly. A small makeup bag was tucked carefully into the side pocket. It did not look like a violent crime scene at all. It looked exactly as if someone had deliberately, carefully placed the bag there for the police to find. The flawless, perfect presentation of the backpack created a massive, horrifying contradiction that completely defied human logic. Was the terrifying predator playing a deeply cruel psychological game with the police? Or was the scene intentionally staged to make the authorities falsely believe that the mayor's daughter had simply decided to run away? The perfect, flawless arrangement of the red canvas backpack completely paralyzed Detective Miller. He was a highly experienced investigator who had spent 2 decades working missing person cases across Indiana. He knew exactly how teenagers behaved when they decided to run away from home. They were chaotic. They were highly emotional. If a 15-year-old girl was running away in the dark, she would never take the time to perfectly align her notebooks, carefully tuck her cellular phone exactly into the center of the bench, and zip every single pocket completely shut. It was an absolute, undeniable stage. Someone incredibly calm, highly methodical, and deeply calculating had placed the bag on the wooden park bench. They had deliberately left it in a highly visible area, entirely intending for the police to find it. They wanted to create a completely false narrative that Macy had simply walked to the park and decided to leave her old life behind. But Mayor Caleb Warren absolutely refused to believe the lie. He stood behind the yellow crime scene tape, the freezing morning air biting at his face, staring at his daughter's belongings. He knew Macy. He knew how deeply she loved her family, her friends, and her life in Oakmont. She had absolutely no reason to run. Detective Miller immediately shifted the entire massive weight of the state police investigation. If the backpack was deliberately planted in the park, they needed to find exactly how it got there. Miller ordered a massive, aggressive dragnet of every single security camera, traffic light monitor, and ATM camera in a 5-mile radius stretching from the high school football stadium to the public park. Dozens of young police officers spent 48 grueling hours staring at small, flickering television monitors, desperately reviewing hundreds of hours of grainy, black and white security footage. On the 3rd day of the agonizing search, a young deputy yelled out from the back of the dark viewing room. He had found something completely terrifying. Caleb and his wife, Sarah, were immediately brought into the secure police precinct. They sat down in a small, dark room alongside Detective Miller. The young deputy pressed play on the heavy video machine. The footage came from an exterior security camera mounted on the side of a local hardware store, located just 3 blocks away from the high school parking lot. The timestamp on the bottom of the screen read 8:20 in the evening, exactly 5 minutes after Macy had walked away from her friends at the carnival. The grainy video showed the dark, quiet sidewalk. Suddenly, Macy walked into the frame. She was alone, wearing her light blue denim jacket. As she walked under the glow of a street lamp, a dark, heavily rusted blue pickup truck slowly pulled into the frame, driving directly alongside her. Caleb leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table with massive, white-knuckled intensity. He desperately prayed that his daughter would run. He silently begged the grainy image on the screen to turn around and sprint back toward the bright lights of the stadium. But Macy didn't run. The blue pickup truck came to a complete stop against the curb. The heavy passenger window slowly rolled down. Macy stopped walking. She turned and stepped closer to the vehicle, leaning slightly toward the open window. She appeared to be having a brief, calm conversation with whoever was sitting behind the steering wheel. She did not look distressed. She was not backing away. Her body language was entirely relaxed and completely normal. And then, the absolute worst nightmare of Caleb's life unfolded on the silent screen. Macy calmly reached out, pulled the heavy metal handle of the passenger door, and willingly climbed inside the truck. She pulled the door shut behind her. The blue truck slowly pulled away from the curb, completely vanishing into the dark night, taking the mayor's daughter with it. Sarah let out a raw, agonizing scream, completely burying her face in her hands. Caleb sat completely frozen, his heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm against his ribs. The footage completely shattered his mind. He had spent 15 years heavily lecturing Macy about the terrifying dangers of the world. He had taught her never, ever to approach a strange vehicle. The fact that she had willingly opened the door and climbed inside without a single moment of hesitation meant something absolutely horrifying. She completely trusted the person driving the truck. Either it was someone she personally knew from her daily life, or the driver was wearing a uniform, like a police officer, a paramedic, or a city utility worker, that made her completely believe she was entirely safe. Detective Miller did not waste a single second. The grainy video had captured the back of the blue truck as it drove away. The license plate was heavily blurred, but state forensic video analysts worked through the night, aggressively applying massive digital filters to the image. By the next morning, they had successfully pulled 4 of the 6 numbers from the rusted license plate. They ran the partial plate alongside the specific make and model of the old blue pickup truck through the state vehicle registry. The massive computer system narrowed the search down to a single, identical vehicle registered in the neighboring county. The truck belonged to a 72-year-old local landscaper named Arthur. A massive convoy of heavily armored state police vehicles and SWAT teams aggressively sped across the county line. They completely surrounded Arthur's small, quiet suburban home, violently kicking the front door open and swarming the living room with their weapons drawn. But as the heavily armed officers pinned the terrified elderly man to the floor, the massive, explosive momentum of the investigation hit a completely unexpected, deeply frustrating brick wall. Arthur was completely terrified and entirely innocent. When detectives aggressively interrogated him in the holding cell, the elderly landscaper broke down in heavy tears, swearing he had absolutely nothing to do with a missing girl. The detectives checked his alibi. It was completely, flawlessly solid. On the exact night Macy was taken, Arthur had been sitting in a crowded local veterans hall, playing cards with nearly 24 highly respectable witnesses who swore he had never left the room. When Detective Miller demanded to know exactly where the blue truck was, Arthur explained a deeply frustrating reality. He had sold the rusted blue truck exactly 2 weeks before the high school fundraiser. Because he was an old, highly trusting man, he had sold the vehicle for $2,000 in pure cash to a young man who had answered a local newspaper advertisement. Arthur had simply handed the keys over and signed the back of the title, completely failing to officially file the heavy transfer paperwork with the state government. Arthur didn't know the buyer's last name. He only knew that the young man called himself Marcus and wore a heavy baseball cap. The police had the weapon, but the monster holding it was completely invisible. Detectives aggressively subpoenaed the classified advertising records from the local newspaper. They managed to pull a single, unregistered burner cellular phone number that had been used to contact Arthur about the truck. Using advanced cellular tower triangulation, state investigators successfully traced the burner phone to a cheap, highly transient motel located on the extreme outskirts of Indianapolis. The state police mobilized instantly. They believed they were finally going to catch the man who had driven the blue truck. They believed they were finally going to bring the mayor's daughter home. But as the heavy convoy of police cruisers aggressively sped down the major interstate highway toward the motel, a sudden, frantic call came across the secure police radio. It was the State Highway Patrol. Just 5 miles ahead of the police convoy, a massive, horrific traffic accident had just occurred on the interstate. A dark blue pickup truck, completely matching the exact description of the suspect's vehicle, had suddenly lost control at over 80 miles an hour. It had violently crossed the grassy median and slammed directly head-on into a massive, heavy commercial semi-truck. The impact was entirely catastrophic. The blue truck had instantly burst into massive, towering flames. Detective Miller and Caleb, who was riding in the passenger seat of the command vehicle, arrived at the accident scene just minutes later. The heat coming from the blazing wreckage was completely suffocating. Firefighters aggressively sprayed heavy white foam onto the twisted, burning metal. Caleb tried to run toward the burning vehicle, desperately screaming his daughter's name, but heavy state troopers violently held him back, pinning him against a police cruiser. When the massive fire was finally, completely extinguished, the forensic technicians approached the smoking, blackened frame of the blue pickup truck. The driver of the truck was completely trapped behind the crushed steering wheel, heavily burned beyond any absolute physical recognition. But as the technicians carefully searched the completely destroyed passenger side of the cabin, the heavy, agonizing silence of the highway confirmed the absolute worst. Macy was not in the truck. The state police launched a massive, aggressive search of the dense woods completely surrounding the highway, terrified that the driver had panicked, killed Macy, and dumped her body somewhere in the dark before trying to flee the state. They searched for weeks. They brought in hundreds of tracking dogs, helicopters, and heavily armed volunteers. They scoured every single ditch, every abandoned barn, and every deep ravine in the entire county. They found absolutely nothing. The massive, highly energized investigation that had completely captivated the state slowly began to collapse. Forensic dentists successfully identified the burned driver of the blue truck. His name was Marcus Vance, a 24-year-old drifter with a long history of severe substance abuse and petty theft. The police officially concluded that Marcus had likely seen Macy walking alone, offered her a ride, and completely succumbed to a violent, impulsive urge. With the primary suspect completely dead and the physical vehicle entirely destroyed, the legal system had absolutely nowhere left to turn. The heavy, unyielding steel doors of the investigation completely slammed shut. With every single lead permanently gone, the case grew completely cold. The devastating passage of time is the absolute cruelest enemy of a grieving parent. As the agonizing months slowly turned into heavy, suffocating years, Caleb Warren's entire world was completely, entirely destroyed. The man who had once exuded massive confidence and unyielding control became an absolute, hollow ghost. He spent his days sitting in his dark office at City Hall, completely ignoring the massive administrative duties of his town, staring blankly at the old, heavily worn photographs of his beautiful daughter. He blamed himself with a profound, highly toxic intensity. He believed that if he had just held her hand at the carnival, if he had just walked her to the car himself, the nightmare would never have happened. The heavy, suffocating guilt completely consumed him from the inside out. The massive tragedy completely fractured his marriage. Sarah could not look at her husband without seeing the exact same face as her missing daughter. The heavy silence in their large, quiet house became incredibly toxic. 2 years after Macy vanished, Sarah packed her bags and quietly moved out, finalizing a deeply painful, completely devastating divorce. Caleb's political career rapidly followed. The citizens of Oakmont deeply pitied their broken mayor, but a town cannot be effectively managed by a ghost. During the next election cycle, Caleb was quietly, heavily defeated by a younger challenger. He packed his belongings into a small cardboard box and completely walked away from the public life he had spent decades building. He moved into a small, dark, deeply isolated house on the edge of the county. His old political friends slowly stopped calling. The community fundraiser was permanently canceled. Every single year, when the calendar turned to Macy's birthday, Caleb would sit completely alone in his dark kitchen, drinking heavy glasses of whiskey, staring at the empty chair across the table, completely trapped in a relentless, agonizing purgatory of ambiguous loss. He was entirely convinced that his daughter was dead, resting somewhere in the cold, dark woods, completely forgotten by a world that had relentlessly moved on. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. 10 long, incredibly painful years passed. The year was now 2015. The world had completely modernized, heavily transitioning into a massive, globally connected digital era filled with social media and instantly shared photographs. Caleb was now in his mid-50s. His dark hair had turned completely solid gray, and his face was heavily lined with a decade of profound, unrelenting exhaustion. But on a quiet, freezing rainy Tuesday evening, a massive, completely unexpected revelation would violently resurrect the 10-year-old nightmare and prove that the police investigation had been entirely, fundamentally wrong from the very beginning. Caleb was sitting alone in his quiet living room, staring blankly at his computer screen. Earlier that week, a retired state police detective had quietly dropped off a heavy cardboard box containing a digitized copy of Macy's original case file, offering it as a final, sympathetic gesture to the broken father. Caleb opened the digital file containing the background check of Marcus Vance, the young drifter who had died in the fiery highway crash 10 years ago. As Caleb scrolled through the old, digitized police reports, his tired eyes suddenly locked onto a highly specific, deeply buried administrative document that had been completely overlooked during the chaotic aftermath of the crash. It was a digitized copy of an old, heavy paper time card from a local manufacturing plant where Marcus Vance had briefly worked. Caleb's breathing completely stopped. The blood instantly, violently drained from his face, leaving his skin completely pale. His hands began to shake wildly against the keyboard. The time card clearly showed that on the exact evening Macy was abducted from the high school fundraiser, Marcus Vance was officially clocked into a heavy machinery shift at a factory located nearly 40 miles away. The factory security logs completely confirmed he had never left the building during his shift. The massive, terrifying reality of the document completely shattered Caleb's mind. Marcus Vance had an absolute, unbreakable alibi for the exact hour of the kidnapping. He was not the man driving the blue pickup truck when it pulled up next to Macy. He was not the man who had calmly spoken to her through the open window. The truck had been stolen again, or deliberately borrowed by someone else entirely. And when the abduction was complete, the true mastermind had completely wiped the vehicle down and seamlessly returned it to the young, unsuspecting drifter, who had simply panicked and crashed days later when the police suddenly chased him for a crime he didn't even know had happened. The dead man was completely innocent, which meant the brilliant, highly calculating, completely invisible phantom who had actually taken the mayor's daughter was still completely unknown, entirely unpunished, and still actively walking around somewhere in the world. The terrifying revelation that the young drifter possessed an absolute, flawless alibi for the exact hour of the kidnapping completely resurrected Caleb Warren. The heavy, suffocating fog of grief and alcohol that had entirely consumed him for a decade was instantly burned away by a massive, blinding flash of pure adrenaline. His daughter had not been taken by a random, impulsive stranger who died in a fiery crash. She had been abducted by a highly intelligent, deeply calculating phantom who had orchestrated the perfect crime and completely walked away. Caleb immediately brought the digital time card directly to Detective Miller. The veteran investigator was completely stunned. The state police rapidly reopened the massive cold case, but the devastating reality of a 10-year trail meant that physical evidence was completely gone. They were hunting a ghost in the dark. But Caleb absolutely refused to sit in his quiet house and wait. He transformed his small, isolated living room into a massive, highly aggressive command center. He spent every single waking hour tearing through online missing person databases, heavily monitoring international forums, and scanning massive archives of unidentified photographs. He was looking for a needle in a global haystack, driven completely by the fierce, unyielding love of a father who finally knew his daughter might still be alive. 6 agonizing months passed. Caleb's eyes were constantly bloodshot, his sleep completely abandoned. And then, late on a quiet Thursday evening, a completely random, entirely ordinary internet post changed the entire history of the investigation forever. Caleb was heavily scrolling through a local, community-based social media page for a neighboring Indiana town. A retired American schoolteacher had recently returned from a long, beautiful vacation to a small, picturesque coastal town in southern France. The tourist had publicly posted a massive digital photo album to share the beautiful scenery with her local friends back in the Midwest. Caleb casually clicked through the bright, vibrant photographs of old European churches, blue ocean waves, and bustling outdoor markets. He clicked to the 40-second photograph in the album. It was a candid picture of a busy, sun-drenched outdoor bakery stall. The American tourist was standing in the foreground, smiling brightly at the camera, holding a small pastry. But Caleb did not look at the tourist. His exhausted eyes drifted completely past the foreground and locked onto the background of the image. Standing behind the wooden counter of the bakery, wiping her hands on a white apron, was a young woman. Caleb completely stopped breathing. The computer mouse slipped entirely from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly onto the wooden floor. The woman in the photograph was in her mid-20s. Her hair was pulled back into a casual ponytail, but the facial structure, the shape of her jaw, and the curve of her smile were absolutely, undeniably familiar. Caleb leaned so close to the glowing monitor that his nose almost touched the glass. His hands were shaking with a violent, massive intensity. He aggressively zoomed in on the young woman's face, enlarging the digital pixels until they were slightly blurry. Just beside her left eyebrow was a tiny, deeply distinct dark birthmark. And resting gently against her collarbone, catching the bright French sunlight, was a delicate, silver necklace perfectly shaped like a small sun. It was the exact same custom necklace Caleb had placed around his daughter's neck on her 14th birthday, a necklace that was completely one of a kind. A massive, raw, agonizing gasp violently tore from Caleb's throat. The heavy, suffocating dam of 10 years of pure torture finally broke. The tears completely flooded his weathered face, dripping heavily onto the keyboard. It was Macy. She was alive. She was standing in the bright sunlight, completely healthy, halfway across the world. Caleb printed the photograph and drove his truck at 90 miles an hour directly to the state police precinct. He burst into Detective Miller's office, aggressively slamming the heavy photograph onto the desk. Miller took one look at the image and immediately contacted the digital forensic laboratory. The technicians spent hours running the heavily zoomed photograph through massive, highly advanced facial recognition geometry software, comparing the young woman in France to the 10-year-old school photographs of Macy Warren. The computer finalized the algorithmic calculation. The structural match was 99%. It was a completely undeniable, absolute confirmation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was immediately brought into the massive case. They urgently contacted Interpol and the French National Police, transmitting the photograph and Macy's original missing person profile. They requested an immediate, highly discreet search of the small coastal town to secure the American citizen. But 24 hours later, the French authorities responded with a massive, completely baffling contradiction. They had heavily scanned the local municipal records of the coastal town. Absolutely no one matching Macy's legal identity existed in the region. There was no American expatriate matching her description, no visa applications under her name, and absolutely no record of a Macy Warren ever entering the country. The FBI urged Caleb to remain in Indiana while they slowly navigated the massive, highly complex international bureaucracy to locate the unidentified woman in the photograph. But Caleb Warren was a father who had spent 10 years living in absolute hell. He absolutely refused to wait a single second for the legal system. Before the state police could confiscate his passport or legally stop him, Caleb purchased a completely direct, first-class ticket on an overnight flight to Europe. 14 hours later, Caleb stepped off a heavily crowded train and walked into the bright, warm sunlight of the small, beautiful French coastal town. The air smelled deeply of salt water and fresh lavender. His heart was pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm against his chest. He held the printed photograph tightly in his hand, rapidly navigating the old, winding cobblestone streets, searching desperately for the specific plaza where the outdoor bakery stall was located. He finally turned a narrow corner and stepped into a bustling, crowded square. And there it was, the small bakery with the green awning. Caleb completely froze. His legs felt entirely like heavy lead. The chaotic noise of the busy market completely faded into an absolute, deafening silence. Standing behind the wooden counter, casually organizing a heavy basket of fresh baguettes, was his daughter. She was incredibly beautiful. She looked completely healthy, entirely relaxed, and deeply happy. She was laughing softly with a local customer in absolutely flawless, perfect French. 10 years of profound, suffocating agony instantly vanished from Caleb's soul. He took a slow, trembling step forward, then another. He walked directly up to the wooden counter, his eyes completely overflowing with heavy, burning tears. The young woman finished her transaction, smiled brightly, and turned her attention to the older man standing in front of her. "Bonjour," she said warmly, her voice perfectly clear. Caleb gripped the edge of the wooden counter, his entire body violently shaking. He looked directly into the beautiful brown eyes he had completely memorized. "Macy," Caleb choked out, his voice cracking into a raw, agonizing whisper. "Macy, it's me, it's Dad." He desperately reached his trembling hand across the counter, expecting her to gasp. He expected the massive, terrifying illusion of the last 10 years to completely shatter. He waited for her to scream his name, to run around the counter, and to violently collapse into his arms. But Macy did not scream, she did not cry. She looked directly into Caleb's desperate, weeping eyes, and she entirely frowned. Her expression was not filled with absolute terror. It was not filled with sudden, overwhelming recognition. It was simply filled with mild, genuine confusion. She looked at him exactly as if he were a completely random, deeply strange tourist who had spoken a language she didn't understand. She took a polite step backward, shaking her head gently. She spoke rapidly in French to a coworker standing nearby, pointing casually at Caleb, indicating that she needed help with a confused customer. She didn't know him. The absolute, devastating horror violently crashed over Caleb, completely shattering his mind into a million jagged pieces. His own daughter had looked directly into his soul, and she had felt absolutely nothing. She had calmly, entirely walked away. Caleb completely collapsed to his knees on the hard cobblestone street, burying his face in his hands, weeping with a massive, uncontrollable agony that echoed heavily across the busy plaza. Within minutes, plainclothes officers from the French National Police, who had been secretly monitoring the bakery per Interpol's request, moved in and gently escorted the devastated father away from the scene to prevent a massive public incident. Caleb sat in a quiet, sterile room inside the local French police precinct, completely broken. The senior French investigator sat across from him, holding a thick, heavy manila folder. The investigator spoke in gentle, heavily accented English, explaining a reality that was completely, utterly terrifying. "We have deeply investigated the young woman at the bakery," the investigator said softly. "Her name is absolutely not Macy Warren. According to the government of France, her legal name is Claire Benoit." The investigator opened the heavy folder, displaying a massive stack of official, heavily stamped government documents. "She is not an undocumented captive," the investigator continued. "She has a completely legal French passport. She has a registered national tax identification number. She possesses heavily documented medical records stretching back nearly 10 years. She pays her taxes. She votes in local elections. And she lives a completely ordinary, fully recognized life. Everything about her identity is absolutely flawless and entirely legitimate." Caleb stared at the documents, his mind completely reeling. It was entirely impossible. A kidnapped 15-year-old American girl could not simply cross international borders, bypass massive immigration security, and instantly generate a flawless, highly complex legal identity in a foreign country without triggering a massive alarm. Building a completely perfect, untraceable fake life required immense, staggering amounts of money, extreme intelligence, and deeply powerful political connections. The predator had not just stolen Macy's physical body. They had completely, systematically erased her entire existence and successfully rebuilt a brand new human being from the ground up. Before we continue, if you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Despite the flawless legal paperwork, Detective Miller and the American FBI agents, coordinating heavily via secure phone lines, demanded absolute physical scientific proof. Documents could be forged, but cellular biology could never lie. A French plainclothes officer quietly returned to the outdoor bakery plaza later that afternoon. He waited patiently until Claire Benoit finished her shift. As she walked to a small cafe and purchased a coffee, the officer watched her carefully. When she finally threw the empty paper cup into a public trash can, the officer immediately retrieved it, placing it carefully into a secure, sterile evidence bag. The disposable cup was aggressively rushed under heavy police guard to a highly advanced, secure DNA laboratory in Paris. Caleb sat in a small hotel room near the police precinct, entirely refusing to sleep or eat for 2 agonizing days. He stared out the window at the dark ocean, his mind trapped in a terrifying, suffocating loop of confusion. If she was Macy, why didn't she recognize him? Had she been heavily drugged? Had she suffered a massive traumatic brain injury that completely erased her past? On the third morning, the secure telephone in the hotel room finally rang. It was Detective Miller calling directly from Indiana. The heavy, exhausted silence on the line spoke volumes before he even said a single word. "The results came back from Paris, Caleb," Miller said, his voice thick with profound emotion. "It's an absolute 100% match. The woman working in the bakery is Macy." There was absolutely no mistake. The impossible was true. Armed with the undeniable biological reality, French authorities gently approached Macy at the bakery later that evening. They brought her into a comfortable, quiet room at the precinct, treating her with absolute, profound care. They brought in a specialized trauma psychologist to speak with her. They gently showed her the 10-year-old photographs of her life in America. They showed her pictures of Caleb, of her high school, and of the charity fundraiser. Macy looked at the photographs, her brow heavily furrowed in genuine, deep concentration. She did not cry. She did not panic. She looked up at the psychologist and spoke quietly in completely fluent French. "I am sorry," she said sincerely, "but I absolutely do not know who these people are. I don't remember anyone named Caleb Warren." The medical doctors and the psychologists heavily evaluated her for hours. Their absolute professional conclusion was completely terrifying. Macy was not lying. She was not acting. She genuinely, truly did not remember her childhood in Indiana. Through highly careful, gentle therapy sessions over the next few days, the psychologists uncovered fragmented, deeply confusing memories buried in her mind. Macy remembered waking up in a hospital bed many years ago, feeling completely terrified and confused. She remembered a kind, gentle man sitting beside her, holding her hand, telling her she had been in a terrible accident and that he was going to take care of her. That man had quietly, methodically, completely rebuilt her entire reality. He had taught her French. He had moved her to Europe. He had given her a beautiful, safe life. The state police and the FBI immediately launched a massive, aggressive investigation into the background of Claire Benoit's legal guardianship. They traced the massive financial wires that paid for her apartment and pulled the property records for the quiet house she lived in just outside the coastal town. They finally identified the man who had raised her. The name on the lease was Victor Hale. The FBI immediately ran his name through every single massive criminal database in the world. They expected to find a highly dangerous, violent international trafficker. They expected a monster with a long, terrifying history of severe crimes. But the computer screens returned a completely blank history. Victor Hale had absolutely no criminal record. He had no history of violence, no arrests, and no outstanding warrants. He was a completely ordinary 50-year-old American citizen who had legally immigrated to France years ago. French police quietly interviewed the neighbors living near Victor's house. The neighbors described him as an incredibly generous, deeply patient, and kind man. They swore he was a wonderfully devoted father who absolutely adored his daughter, Claire, and treated her with profound, unwavering respect. Absolutely nothing about the psychological profile fit the brutal, terrifying reality of a man who had abducted a 15-year-old girl from a busy high school carnival. The massive, terrifying mystery completely deepened. Who exactly was Victor Hale? Why did he possess the massive resources required to forge international documents? And most importantly, if he was not a violent monster, why had he completely stolen the mayor's daughter and carefully erased her entire past? The invisible phantom who had haunted Caleb Warren's nightmares for 10 long years had finally been found. But the truth hiding behind his quiet, generous facade was about to completely unravel a massive, decades-old conspiracy that would permanently shake the foundation of Oakmont, Indiana. The massive, highly coordinated international operation to arrest the invisible phantom finally moved forward. At exactly 6 o'clock the following morning, a heavy convoy of French tactical police vehicles completely surrounded Victor Hale's quiet, picturesque home located just a few miles outside the coastal town. Caleb Warren sat in the back of an unmarked command vehicle, his heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm. He desperately braced himself for a massive, violent standoff. He expected the ruthless monster who had stolen his daughter to heavily barricade the doors and fight to the absolute bitter end. But as the heavily armed tactical officers moved silently across the green lawn, their heavy rifles raised, the front door of the house simply clicked open. Victor Hale stepped out onto the wooden porch. He was a completely ordinary-looking man in his early 50s, wearing a simple gray sweater. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He looked exactly like a man who had been quietly, patiently waiting for this exact moment for 10 agonizing years. Victor did not run. He did not raise a weapon. He simply placed his empty hands heavily on top of his head and slowly walked down the wooden steps, dropping directly to his knees in the damp morning grass. As the tactical officers rushed forward, violently securing his wrists in heavy steel handcuffs, Victor did not resist. He looked directly at the command vehicle where Caleb was sitting behind the tinted glass. Victor spoke his very first words to the arresting officers in completely flawless, calm English. "I never touched her to hurt her," Victor whispered, his voice thick with a profound, heavy sorrow. Within an hour, Victor Hale was sitting inside a secure, sterile interrogation room at the local French police precinct. Caleb stood in the dark observation room, his hands pressed heavily against the glass, staring at the man who had completely destroyed his life. The senior investigators expected Victor to demand a high-priced international lawyer. They expected him to completely deny the charges or aggressively negotiate for a reduced sentence. But Victor completely surrendered. He waived absolutely all of his legal rights and began to calmly, quietly confess to the entire, horrifying nightmare. He admitted to completely orchestrating the 1995 abduction. He admitted to paying the young drifter pure cash for the blue truck without filing the paperwork. He admitted to planting the red canvas backpack in the park to completely throw the state police off his trail. And he admitted to using highly sophisticated, massive underground connections to completely forge a brand new French legal identity for the young girl. But when the investigators aggressively demanded to know exactly why he had taken the mayor's daughter, Victor's answer completely shattered the entire psychological profile of the case. He didn't take her for a massive financial ransom. He didn't take her for political leverage. Victor looked directly into the two-way mirror, knowing Caleb was standing on the other side. "I didn't want his money," Victor said, the heavy tears finally spilling over his weathered cheeks. "I wanted only one thing. I wanted her father to feel exactly what my family felt." The terrifying, deeply cryptic confession completely baffled the French investigators. But thousands of miles away in Indiana, Detective Miller was listening to the live audio feed of the interrogation. Miller's brilliant, highly analytical mind immediately began tearing aggressively through the massive municipal archives of Oakmont. If Victor Hale was driven entirely by a massive, catastrophic family tragedy, Miller needed to find out exactly what the mayor of Oakmont had done to completely destroy the Hale family. It took 48 hours of grueling, exhausting archival digging, but Detective Miller finally uncovered a forgotten, deeply buried municipal tragedy from exactly 12 years earlier. In the bitter winter of 1993, a massive, catastrophic structural collapse had occurred at a large commercial warehouse in the center of Oakmont. The building had completely caved in during a heavy snowstorm. The massive disaster had severely injured several people and cost the city millions of dollars in severe municipal damages. The city desperately needed someone to blame. Victor's younger brother, a highly respected, deeply dedicated local fire inspector named David Hale, had officially signed off on the warehouse safety inspection just weeks before the collapse. When the massive public outrage exploded, Mayor Caleb Warren had aggressively stepped in front of the television cameras. Instead of demanding a slow, highly meticulous search for the absolute truth, Caleb had chosen to completely protect the city's powerful commercial developers. Caleb publicly, fiercely defended a completely rushed internal investigation that placed the absolute entire blame directly onto David Hale. The young fire inspector was publicly disgraced. He was completely stripped of his career, his honorable reputation was entirely destroyed, and the massive, suffocating public shame completely ended his marriage. 6 months after Caleb signed the public statement condemning him, David Hale drove to a quiet, isolated park and tragically ended his own life. But Detective Miller uncovered the absolute, terrifying truth buried completely at the bottom of the municipal archives. David Hale was completely innocent. A massive, highly detailed independent engineering report had been filed just days after the collapse, explicitly proving that the warehouse fell because of severe, highly illegal construction shortcuts taken by a private commercial contractor. David Hale had been completely framed to protect a wealthy, highly corrupt construction company, and the real engineering report clearing his name had been deliberately, quietly buried deep inside the city records. When Detective Miller transmitted the horrifying documents over the secure line to the French precinct, Caleb Warren completely collapsed into a chair in the observation room. The massive, terrifying reality violently washed over him. Caleb stared at the documents, his hands shaking wildly. "I never saw this report," Caleb whispered, his voice trembling with absolute primal devastation. "I swear to God I never saw it. They told me the fire inspector was guilty." Caleb realized with absolute, bone-chilling certainty that his trusted senior advisors inside City Hall had deliberately hidden the exonerating evidence from him to completely protect their wealthy political donors. The entire kidnapping case suddenly became massively larger than a grieving brother's revenge. It was a massive, highly toxic web of systemic political corruption. Back in Indiana, Detective Miller aggressively tracked down the retired city clerk who had managed the municipal archives in 1993. When Miller cornered the elderly man in his quiet suburban home, threatening him with massive federal obstruction charges, the retired clerk completely broke down. He wept heavily, confessing that several crucial documents had deliberately disappeared just days before Caleb signed the public statement blaming Victor's brother. The corrupt city officials had completely manipulated the naive, politically driven mayor, and their massive, silent greed had directly triggered the total destruction of 2 innocent families. While the massive political scandal exploded back in the United States, French tactical teams aggressively tore Victor Hale's coastal home completely apart, desperately searching for physical evidence of the abduction. What they found inside the quiet, beautifully maintained house completely defied the absolute definition of a monster. They did not find heavy chains, locked basement doors, or hidden torture devices. Instead, they discovered a massive, highly organized filing cabinet in Victor's home office. The folders contained hundreds of highly detailed, deeply meticulous surveillance logs from 2004, exactly 1 year before Macy vanished. Victor had secretly, quietly followed Macy for almost an entire year before taking her. But he didn't study her to hurt her. He meticulously studied her daily routines, her favorite teachers, her close friends, and her exact medical needs to completely ensure she would never, ever be physically harmed during the transition. His massive revenge was incredibly calculated, but it was strangely, overwhelmingly protective. But the most completely heartbreaking, absolutely devastating evidence was found carefully hidden inside a heavy, fireproof safe in the bedroom closet. The French investigators pulled out a stack of 10 sealed, heavily padded envelopes. Each envelope was explicitly addressed to Mayor Caleb Warren at City Hall in Oakmont. None of them had ever been mailed. Inside each envelope was a single digital video disc. Caleb sat in the dark police precinct, his hands shaking violently as the French detectives played the videos on a small television monitor. They were secret birthday videos. Every single year on Macy's birthday, Victor had quietly recorded her from a distance. The videos showed Macy completely healthy, beautifully happy, and entirely safe. She was blowing out candles on a cake. She was learning how to ride a bicycle through the old cobblestone streets. She was laughing brightly on the beach. Victor had recorded every single video, completely intending to mail them to Caleb. He wanted the grieving mayor to know that his daughter was alive and perfectly safe. But he could absolutely never bring himself to send the evidence. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. The French forensic psychologists working with Macy slowly began to make a massive, incredible breakthrough. Through highly gentle, deeply compassionate therapy, Macy's heavily fragmented, buried childhood memories slowly began to return. She remembered the terrified confusion of the first few months, but she also remembered that Victor had never, ever raised his voice at her. He had never locked her in a room. He had entirely fabricated a deeply complex story about a tragic accident to explain her lack of memories, and he had completely dedicated his entire existence to making her feel absolutely safe and deeply loved. The psychologists revealed a massive, highly emotional truth to Caleb. Macy had suddenly remembered the exact moment she started calling Victor Dad. It had not happened immediately. She had fiercely refused to call him that for nearly 3 years. Victor had never forced her. He had never demanded it. He simply waited, treating her with profound, unconditional patience. The title of father had developed completely naturally over time, built entirely on years of genuine, undeniable care. The massive, terrifying lines between captor and savior were completely, permanently blurred. The final, absolute proof of Victor's internal torment was discovered when investigators finally cracked the heavy lock on his personal journals. The early entries, written in 2005, were heavily filled with a massive, burning anger and a desperate desire for revenge for his dead brother. But as the detectives read the later entries, written years after the abduction, the tone completely, fundamentally shifted. The pages were no longer celebrating revenge. They were entirely filled with a massive, suffocating, completely paralyzing guilt. Victor wrote about how incredibly intelligent Macy was. He wrote about her beautiful smile and her kind heart. He realized that he had completely ruined the life of an innocent child who had absolutely nothing to do with the corrupt politics of Oakmont. The final journal entry, written just a few months before Caleb discovered the photograph, completely broke the hearts of the hardened detectives. "I have to tell her the truth," Victor wrote, his handwriting trembling across the page. "I have to send her back to her real family. Every single year the lie becomes heavier, but I am completely terrified. If I tell her the truth, she will look at me like a monster, and I will absolutely lose the beautiful daughter I have genuinely come to love more than my own life. I am completely trapped in the prison I built for him." Back in Indiana, Detective Miller violently kicked open the heavy wooden door of an old, abandoned municipal storage facility on the edge of town. Guided by the terrified confession of the retired city clerk, Miller and his team aggressively tore through heavy, dust-covered boxes of old city records. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, Miller pulled a thick, heavily faded manila folder from the very bottom of a rotting cardboard box. He opened the heavy cover and shined his tactical flashlight directly onto the documents. It was the original, completely unaltered independent engineering report from 1993. The massive document explicitly detailed exactly how the corrupt private construction contractor had used highly illegal, deeply substandard materials to build the warehouse, directly causing the deadly collapse. It proved with absolute, flawless scientific certainty that David Hale had done absolutely nothing wrong. Miller held the heavily guarded physical proof in his hands. The absolute, undeniable truth was finally exposed to the light. Thousands of miles away in the quiet French police precinct, Caleb Warren stared blankly at the wall, the heavy tears silently tracking down his deeply weathered face. The massive, horrifying reality completely settled over his soul. Caleb realized that his greatest, most unforgivable mistake wasn't directly causing the tragedy. His greatest failure was trusting powerful, wealthy political advisors without ever demanding to verify the physical evidence himself. His absolute failure to lead, and his cowardly silence after the report disappeared, had completely destroyed an innocent family, and it had directly triggered the 10-year nightmare that stole his only child. The stage was finally, perfectly set for the absolute climax of the 10-year tragedy. The truth was entirely exposed. The phantom was in handcuffs, but the emotional damage could absolutely never be undone. Caleb slowly stood up from his chair, knowing he finally had to walk down the dark hallway and come face to face with the man who had stolen his daughter, to confront the massive, devastating sins of the past. The heavy, metal door of the French interrogation room clicked quietly open. Macy Warren, the young woman who had spent the last 10 years completely believing her name was Claire Benoit, slowly walked into the cold, sterile room. Victor Hale was sitting heavily at the metal table, his wrists secured in steel handcuffs. When he heard her quiet footsteps, he completely froze. He could not bring himself to look up. He stared directly at the floor, his shoulders shaking with a profound, suffocating shame. The French detectives and Caleb Warren watched in absolute, heavy silence through the two-way glass in the adjoining observation room. Caleb's hands were pressed tightly against the glass, his heart aching for his daughter. Macy walked across the room and pulled out a metal chair. She sat down directly across from the man who had completely stolen her life, but who had also spent a decade making her feel entirely safe and deeply loved. The massive, terrifying psychological conflict in her eyes was absolutely heartbreaking to witness. She did not scream at him. She did not violently hit the table. She looked at his graying hair and his trembling hands. "I remember everything now," Macy said quietly, her voice perfectly steady in the quiet room. "I remember the high school. I remember my father. I remember you taking me." Victor squeezed his eyes completely shut, the heavy tears openly spilling over his cheeks. He simply nodded, entirely unable to speak. Macy leaned slightly forward. Instead of asking him the obvious question of why he had kidnapped her in the first place, she asked a completely different, deeply piercing question that completely shattered Victor's soul. "You realized years ago that my father was not the monster you thought he was," Macy whispered, her voice cracking with raw, agonizing emotion. "You knew he had been completely lied to by the city officials. You knew he didn't intentionally murder your brother. So why didn't you bring me home? Why did you let him suffer for 10 years? Victor completely broke down. He rested his forehead against the cold metal table and wept with a massive, entirely uncontrollable agony. The absolute, terrifying truth he had hidden from himself for a decade was finally dragged into the bright light. "Because I became completely terrified," Victor cried, his voice heavily muffled against the table. "The revenge disappeared after a few years. I stopped wanting to hurt him, but by then you were my entire world. You were my daughter. I knew that if I told you the truth, you would look at me exactly the way you are looking at me right now. You would see a monster. I couldn't bear to lose you. I was entirely too weak to do the right thing." Fear had completely replaced revenge. The massive, terrifying lie had grown so large that Victor had become entirely trapped inside it, choosing to permanently destroy Caleb's life simply to protect his own fragile, stolen happiness. Macy stood up from the metal chair. The tears were heavily tracking down her beautiful face, but her expression was fiercely resolute. She looked at the completely broken man one last time, turned around, and quietly walked out of the interrogation room. A few minutes later, the heavy door opened again. This time, the man who walked into the room was Mayor Caleb Warren. Caleb did not rush forward. He did not grab Victor by the throat. The 10 years of absolute, suffocating hatred he had carried in his heart had been completely complicated by the devastating, undeniable revelation of the buried engineering report. Caleb sat down in the exact same metal chair his daughter had just vacated. For a long, heavy moment, the two men simply sat across from each other in absolute, deafening silence. They were completely stripped of their titles and their pride. They were simply two deeply broken fathers, completely destroyed by the massive, catastrophic consequences of a 12-year-old municipal tragedy. Victor slowly raised his head, his face heavily stained with tears. He looked directly into the hollow, exhausted eyes of the man he had spent a decade torturing. Neither man tried to aggressively defend himself. The massive weight of their mutual destruction was far too heavy for excuses. "I never saw the engineering report that cleared your brother," Caleb whispered, his voice incredibly hoarse. "I swear to you on my own life I never saw it, but that does not completely excuse what I did. I was the mayor. I was supposed to be the final shield for the innocent people of my town. I trusted wealthy, corrupt men because it was politically easy. I failed your brother, Victor, and my failure cost him his life." Victor stared at Caleb, the profound, unyielding truth of the confession completely washing over him. The monster he had imagined for 10 years did not exist. Caleb was just a flawed, heavily manipulated man who had made a terrible mistake. "And I completely failed as a human being," Victor replied, his voice shaking violently. "I wanted to punish you for crossing a line, and to do it I crossed an absolutely unforgivable line myself. I stole a beautiful, innocent child. I completely destroyed her family. I became the exact monster I was desperately trying to destroy." The interrogation room fell completely silent again. There was absolutely no forgiveness offered between the two men. The damage they had inflicted upon each other was entirely too massive, too permanently devastating to ever be washed away by a simple apology. They both sat quietly, entirely accepting the heavy, absolute guilt they would carry for the rest of their natural lives. 3 months later, the massive, highly publicized legal proceedings began in a heavily guarded federal courthouse back in Indiana. Victor Hale had been officially extradited back to the United States. He stood before the federal judge, heavily shackled and wearing a bright orange prison uniform. The courtroom was completely packed with national media reporters, state police investigators, and the completely stunned citizens of Oakmont. The entire country was heavily focused on the trial of the phantom kidnapper. But the absolute, undisputed turning point of the massive trial did not come from the prosecutors or the defense attorneys. It came directly from the witness stand. Macy Warren slowly walked into the massive courtroom. She was no longer wearing the casual apron of a French bakery worker. She was dressed in a sharp, elegant suit. She walked with a profound, unshakable confidence. She was entirely reclaiming her real name, and she was completely taking control of her own narrative. She took the heavy oath and sat down in the wooden witness box. When the federal prosecutor asked her to describe her decade of captivity, Macy delivered a deeply emotional, incredibly powerful testimony that completely silenced the massive room. She absolutely refused to excuse Victor's actions. She looked directly at the man who had raised her in France and fiercely condemned the profound, devastating trauma of the kidnapping. She spoke about the terrifying, heavy confusion she had felt as a child, and the agonizing, completely stolen years her real father had suffered in the dark. But then, Macy completely shifted the entire trajectory of the trial. She turned her fierce, beautiful brown eyes directly toward the back of the courtroom, where several wealthy, highly connected former city officials were sitting comfortably in the gallery. Macy absolutely refused to let the court ignore the original, massive corruption that had directly triggered the entire nightmare. "Victor Hale is a kidnapper, and he absolutely deserves to go to prison," Macy said, her voice echoing loudly and clearly across the silent courtroom. "But he did not build the corruption in this town. He did not bury the engineering report. He did not completely destroy the life of an innocent fire inspector named David Hale to protect a wealthy construction company. If this court truly cares about absolute justice, you cannot simply lock Victor away and pretend the massive, toxic rot inside City Hall does not exist." Her incredibly brave, fiercely intelligent words completely ignited a massive firestorm. The federal prosecutors were entirely backed into a corner by the intense public pressure generated by her testimony. They immediately reopened the decades-old warehouse collapse investigation. Detective Miller and a massive team of federal agents aggressively raided the homes and private offices of the retired city officials. The massive, completely terrifying web of systemic political corruption was finally, violently torn down. Months later, the heavy wooden gavel finally slammed down in the federal courthouse. Victor Hale was officially sentenced to a massive, consecutive 25-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary for the kidnapping of Macy Warren. He quietly accepted his heavy punishment, entirely refusing to file a single legal appeal. But Victor was not the only man led away in heavy steel chains. Several prominent, wealthy former city officials, including the corrupt political advisors who had deliberately buried the engineering report and manipulated the mayor, were also heavily indicted and sentenced to federal prison for massive obstruction of justice, severe corruption, and entirely destroying the life of the innocent fire inspector. The absolute truth had finally, violently cleansed the town of Oakmont. Following the massive sentencings, Caleb Warren walked out onto the high marble steps of the federal courthouse. Dozens of flashing cameras and bright television lights completely surrounded him. He stood before the microphones, looking incredibly tired but completely at peace. He issued a profound, deeply emotional public apology directly to the surviving members of the Hale family. He fully, unconditionally accepted his massive administrative failure in 1993. And then, he officially announced that he was permanently, entirely resigning from public life. He walked away from the microphones, completely leaving politics behind forever to focus entirely on the only thing that truly mattered. But the deeply anticipated, heavily romanticized fairytale ending that the national media desperately wanted absolutely did not happen. Trauma is not erased by a simple court verdict. 10 years of completely stolen life cannot simply be magically restored. Macy Warren made a massive, incredibly mature decision that completely shocked the citizens of Indiana. She chose not to return permanently to the United States. She absolutely refused to move back into Caleb's quiet house and pretend she was still a 15-year-old high school student. She was a 25-year-old woman. She had completely grown up in the beautiful, sun-drenched streets of southern France. Her friends, her career, and her entire understanding of the world were deeply rooted in Europe. She officially reclaimed her real American name, entirely leaving Claire Benoit in the past, but she chose to remain in the small coastal town in France. She refused to let the kidnapping completely define or destroy the beautiful life she had built for herself. Instead of forcing an impossible return to the past, Macy and Caleb chose to slowly, carefully build a completely brand new future together. Caleb sold his dark, isolated house in Indiana and purchased a small, quiet apartment in the French coastal town. He traveled back and forth across the ocean, spending months at a time living just a few streets away from his daughter. Their reunion was not instantly perfect. It was incredibly slow, frequently awkward, and deeply, profoundly emotional. They had to completely learn how to speak to each other again. Caleb had to accept that the little girl he had lost was completely gone, heavily replaced by a fierce, independent, brilliant young woman he desperately wanted to know. But they never gave up. They spent quiet, sunny afternoons drinking coffee at the outdoor bakery plaza. They walked slowly along the beautiful, bright blue ocean. They heavily shared their grief, their massive regrets, and their beautiful, tentative hopes for the future. The love between the father and the daughter had never, ever been completely lost. It had simply been violently interrupted. And slowly, day by day, they rebuilt their absolute, unbreakable bond, finding deep peace in the simple, beautiful reality that they were finally, truly together again. The story of the mayor's daughter who vanished from the crowded carnival stands as a chilling, profoundly tragic reminder of the absolute, devastating destruction caused by toxic political corruption. It proves that burying the truth to protect the powerful will always, eventually, completely destroy the innocent. But far more importantly, it leaves a heavy, deeply haunting message about the absolute, terrifying nature of vengeance. Victor Hale completely believed that his highly calculated revenge would bring justice for his dead brother, but revenge absolutely never heals pain. It only mutates into a massive, heavily destructive force that traps completely innocent people inside the darkness. Even when the absolute truth is finally exposed, and even when true justice eventually, forcefully arrives, the scars remain permanently etched into the soul. Time is the absolute, most precious currency in the human experience, and it is the one thing that no court, no apology, and no amount of profound love can ever truly recover. But as Caleb and Macy Warren walked quietly together along the bright French coast, they proved that, while you can absolutely never get the stolen years back, you can always bravely choose to walk out of the dark shadows, completely forgive yourself, and step fiercely into the beautiful light of whatever time you have left.